So I've been looking into things and thinking about things and finding out a little bit of stuff. And I had been thinking about mathematics, which I learnt in school a long time ago here in Ireland, and well, it was good enough. It was fun. I've come back to it after many years and finding stuff there that I never found before. By going back to the origins, trying to dig under mathematics and see what's there. And that sometimes means going back to the Greeks, you see, and I've been looking into the Greek end of things. I have a good friend in County Wicklow. His name's Victor Langheld, and he runs a sculpture garden there. He spent 30 years in India looking into things as well, in the most general sense. And so we were sitting in his garden having a conversation one day, and he said a most extraordinary thing.
The nature of irrational numbers was that they weren't made out of countable quantities.
Well, look, friend, there are no such thing as numbers. There's only one number, and that's one. All the other numbers are symbols for the relationships of one to more ones.
Yeah.
Well, as you can see, that did my head in a little bit. Victor's always very thought-provoking. There's only one number, and that's one. I think this is worth asking into. And he said all the other numbers, all that they are symbols of the relationship of one to more ones. So you need one to kick things off. And then to get into the counting business, you'd need that one, and then you'd need symbols to express the relationship of other things. If we had that first one, we could start mathematics. It'd be brilliant. Now, funnily enough, there's a finding in cognitive science that lends a great deal of credence to this, and it comes from a very strange time. In the 70s and 80s, these scientists were engaged in a rather foolish business of trying to teach chimpanzees and gorillas to talk. Chimpanzees and gorillas don't talk much. And they tried it with symbols and sounds and all kinds of things. But buried in all that confusion, and you're not allowed to do that with apes anymore, it's not a good idea. But there was a really interesting finding. David and Anne Premack had two chimpanzees. One was called Sarah and one was called Sheba. And now Sheba was trained precisely in what Victor was just alluding to. She was trained to recognize the symbol for a number and to know that that meant a specific quantity of things. So she'd see a 3 and she'd know there was 3 things somewhere. And they used to play a game with Sheba and Sarah. Sarah wasn't trained on numbers. And the game goes like this. The animal keepers repeatedly bring out 2 plates of treats. And there's always more treats on one plate than on the other. And if you bring them out, they're presented to Sheba. And the rule of the game is this. Whichever plate Sheba points to, Sarah gets. It's a very simple game. Chimpanzees can learn it very quickly. But if you bring out 5 treats on this plate and 2 treats on this one, Sheba can't help but point at the one with more treats on it. She goes, give me those. And then Sarah gets it, because that's the rules of the game. And then Sheba goes off in a huff and is very upset. But if you change the game ever so slightly and you cover these treats over with fine domes and you put a number on the outside to say how many treats are inside, now you bring out 2 covered dishes, and one says 5 and one says 2. And Sheba, who now has the power of symbols at her disposal, can distance herself from the appetitive flow of the treats, can do a little calculation, can point to the one that says 2, knowing that Sarah will get that, and she'll get the one with 5 treats. So that's some sign that this business of simply having a symbol for a number is necessary in order to think quantitatively. But we have to come back now as to this business of one. I'm sure it's a very big surprise to you to know that there's only one number and that's 1, and you thought there's all the numbers in the world. And 1 is a really interesting thing to think about, because if you think about it, if you have 1, then you have something that's separate from everything else. And as you well know, everything is connected to everything else. Nothing is disconnected from anything. Reality is continuous. So 1 without any connection to anything else would be kind of odd in the real world where everything is connected to everything. In fact, one without another is a bit of a puzzle. It's one way that people have chosen in the past to speak of that illusory being, God. And there the one can be either maximal, like unity, the whole universe, all that ever is, was, and will be. Nature, that's one sense of one, just all-encompassing unity. But it can be as small as you like as well. One without another doesn't come with a size fixed in. One without another could be the very notion of an individual. Now, people all regard themselves as individuals, but not only is no man an island, there are no individuals. So this is a bit peculiar. We'll come back to the individuality question, but one without another is also a very old and very powerful idea of an atom. If you inquire into the constitution of the world, you might ask what all this stuff is made up of. And very many people have come up with the idea, well, there must be some smallest unsplittable bit from which everything arises. This is not an idea that belongs to any one person. This has arisen in Greek context, famously, with people like Democritus, and was rendered beautifully into verse by the Roman poet Lucretius. But the Indians had similar considerations in the Nyaya school, I think, in the Vaisheshika, but Victor knows more about that end of things than I do. Now, of course, we speak of atoms as if atoms were part of our scientific vocabulary. My mother and father were both chemists, and my sister chose to announce one day when she was about 15 that she didn't believe in atoms. And to be honest with you, we didn't know what she meant. We thought, that's crazy. How could you not, like, where's chemistry going to go if there's no atoms? Well, it turns out she had a point. In this sense of the smallest unsplittable constituent part of the world, there are no atoms, and science has never found any atoms. Modern science went for a different thing, which has to do with corpuscles, corpuscularianism. And it comes in many, many varieties, but they've never found an unsplittable unit. And indeed, the absence of the atom from modern physics is really important because, as you know, reality is continuous. But these discussions have been gone on over the centuries, and they've been very interesting to watch because proponents of atoms have tended to have run-ins with the religious authorities, you see. An atom as one without another looks very different from the big man God, if you think of God as a big man or a source of authority. Victor over there is some class of a Charvaka, that was an Indian school of materialists and atomists. And the debate around the atom has always been fraught with fear of the vacuum or the void or nothing. You'd need something for the atoms to move in. You'd need space without anything in it. And good luck finding space without anything in it. I mean, you can buy yourself all the vacuum pumps in the world and you won't find space without anything in it. Furthermore, the manner in which you treat matter, the stuff that's supposedly made up of atoms, is going to greatly influence where you think the qualities of everything are. And it wasn't John Locke, the idea that primary and secondary qualities are separate, with primary qualities inhering in substance and secondary qualities being products of the perceiver. That one recurs again and again. It occurs in India, it occurs in Greece, it occurs in Europe, it occurs all over the place. So there's all these persistent problems. And I want to point out something that I haven't seen pointed out anywhere else, is that there are two atomisms that bedevil us. One you might associate with matter. I know we use physical, but physical is a difficult word. You know, stuff, matter, stuff, this kind of stuff. And that's the atomism everyone thinks of. But there's another atomism, which is a psychological atomism. The notion of I as being one without another, of a distinguished-minded individual, is also an atomism. There's an atomism of the material and an atomism of the psyche, which is where this guy comes in, René Descartes. In my line of business, everyone likes to throw tomatoes at Rene Descartes and accuse him of being a dualist with an unlikely metaphysics. He was just a Frenchman, and he lived at a time of religious wars, and he was a big-haired genius, and he did lots of things. He's most known for that philosophical throwaway line, I think, therefore I am, producing a thing called the cogito, and the cogito is precisely the psychological atom I'm talking about. He didn't fill it with anything. Descartes' cogito has nothing in it. It has nothing other than bare oneness without another. Now, people like to make fun of Descartes, but they completely mistake what he contributed, you see. One of the things that people like to make fun of him is because they think we know about brains and Descartes didn't know about brains. And Descartes had to explain how his psychology, his psychological atom, or the thinking stuff, should interact with the material stuff. And he pointed vaguely to a thing called the pineal gland. And you've probably seen this picture on various websites, and it's a let's laugh at Descartes picture. Look how little he knows, look how wonky his anatomy is. And he didn't even know what the pineal was, and now we know all about the pineal. This is complete nonsense. We do not know all about the pineal, we know very little about the brain. But to consider the genius of Descartes' identification of the pineal, all it's necessary to do is to point to yourself. If you think of yourself, as Descartes did, as a rationally minded individual, big-brained, rationally minded Christian soul, and you're going to point to your cogito, you'd point like this, you'd point like this, and you'd point like this, and the intersection of those three planes is very nearly where the pineal lies. The pineal is a photosensitive part of the brain. We have two other photosensitive parts of the brain. We call them the retinas on the eyeball. People like to joke about the third eye of Shiva. I'm going to assert we know very, very little about the brains, and the photosensitivity of the pineal will turn out to be interesting, but let's not go there. There's lots more to discuss where we're still discussing the notion of one. You see, what Descartes really changed, and only the mathematicians seem to have noticed, is he changed geometry. Now, the Greeks had insane ways of approaching geometry, a very beautiful spiritual art done with a compass and a straight line. And Descartes was the one who drew in the coordinate axes so that you could write your little measuring units on them, and put a big stake in the middle at a point called 0. You see, as well, if there's only one number and that's 1, there certainly is no number 0. But this coordinate system changed the whole game. Now mathematicians were going to throw their functions onto their whiteboards and blackboards, and they could see all the miracle of number with metric. Now, Greek geometry was never metric. It did not have a measuring unit. And people seem to think Descartes just made things clear, but he didn't. He changed the whole game with the coordinate system and the 0 point. That's what Descartes actually did. Now, most mathematicians are unaware of the kind of problems we're going to be discussing here and possibly in future videos. I'm going to point in the below this video, you'll find some links to a contemporary mathematician, Norman Wildberger, who does all kinds of wonderful stuff. One thing is that he doesn't believe in real numbers, you see. And real numbers now, by those we mean those funny ones that you don't get by counting. We just got all the counting numbers if we had 1, but that leaves all the numbers of the continuum. The square root of 2 is the one most people talk about, and then they talk about pi, and then they talk about e, but there's a few more. There's rather a lot more. So I'll put some links to some of his videos down there. And so what we're going to explore here in various registers combines two questions. One is the well-known issue, discussed by Wigner, of the unreasonable efficacy of mathematics. You see, physics and mathematics are wedded at the hip, but no one's quite sure what the nature of that marriage is. Mathematics seems to work wonderfully when it's employed in certain ways. So the unreasonable efficacy of mathematics is one question we'll be exploring, but it's going to be tied to another one, which is the necessity of the unreasonable question of 1, which was just posed by Victor. The necessity of the unreasonable question of 1 means that we don't have 1, we don't have a measurement unit. How are we ever going to build anything? How are we ever going to measure things? So, the way this will unfold in subsequent videos is to inquire into what kind of statement or what kind of inquiry could someone with a body conduct. If you were an embodied one, you would be calling yourself one without another. Now, this is not a mind or a cogito. I happen to have a perfectly good body here, and so I'm an embodied one, and I think with this perplexity, the embodied one is faced with this unreasonable question of one, and we'll try and see where that goes. So, just to get into the feel of things, here's a little picture to contemplate at the end. We'll be doing some geometry in subsequent videos, and this figure combines three things. It combines a circle. Now, circles get mixed up in the God business very, very quickly. God is the circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. That has been said by many people. Nobody knows who said it first. The circle's curved, you'll notice that. It has no parts, but it is curved, and it does have a center. There's a point at the center. Now, inscribed in the circle in classic Greek style here is a square which has countable sides. It doesn't much matter whether we're talking about a square with 4 sides or a hexagon with 6 sides. Once we have a countable number of sides in a regular figure, we can inscribe it into a circle, and then there are points of contact. Now, I've drawn one additional feature here, which is a diagonal line. It's a diameter of the circle, a diagonal of the square, and its 2 endpoints are those points which are common to both the inscribed square and the circumscribed circle. This figure gives us an awful lot to think about when we ask about number, about one, about counting, and the continuum. So we'll have to do a few more videos to make use of this, but this has been a fun start anyway. So we'll stop there, I think.